Well, good morning. Hope everyone stayed dry as possible this past week with all the rain that we've had. I know the kids out at camp were made the best of it with the rain as well as they could, and I know they had a good week. I know it was a very good week out there. Those of you who didn't see on Facebook or don't know, Allie Paris was baptized out at camp this week, so we're very thankful for that, very happy about that. I know there was at least a couple other, three more baptisms from children from kids from other congregations. So it was definitely a good week out there. And I know several of ours, they got home Friday night and then turned around Saturday morning and headed to Memphis for the Foundations Camp. We've got several that are up there for that, so let's keep them in our prayers as well. So this morning we'll be mostly in Matthew chapter 13. I was telling Riley this morning, that's the chapter we were going to be studying from, and she was like, oh, and she turned to it in her Bible and she's like, oh, that's the parable chapter. I said, yes, it is. That's what we're going to be talking about this morning. So in general, I want to talk about parables, about these parables specifically in this chapter, but maybe if we've got time, go beyond this chapter and look at some other parables of Jesus and what we can learn about them. First off, we use this term a lot. We understand it, I think, generally, those of us in the church. But really, what is a parable? Okay. It's one of the most common definitions I've heard. An earthly story with a heavenly meaning.
It's the way Jesus decided to teach.
It was his preferred method of teaching, especially to the masses, to the large groups that would come and hear him speak. He would speak more directly with his disciples, and we'll see that, those that were closest to him. But he did speak in parables quite a bit to the large followings that would come after him. I looked it up, and really the word, this is another one of these words that kind of has just been passed down from the original Greek language, and we've, through the years, the etymology of the word has eventually come down into our English. But really, in the original Greek, and even now we still use it the same way, it really just means a comparison or an analogy or an illustration. That's really all it is. And we understand that. I mean, preachers now today use illustrations in their teaching to help us understand these concepts maybe in a little bit plainer language, in a way that maybe we can understand a little bit better. But in some ways as well, and we'll see this, Jesus also used it to speak directly to those who really wanted to hear his message. So as Roger mentioned, this was a way that Jesus taught to the masses. Why did he choose to speak to them in parables?
That's what they understood. That was their daily life.
In some ways, yes.
From Isaiah to say, God said through Isaiah, a certain person, God doesn't want them to understand because of their mindset that didn't love his word to begin with.
Yeah, if we skip ahead a little bit here, in Matthew chapter 13, and start in verse 10, this is after the first parable that he's told. Then the disciples came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And he answered, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, 'You will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it. Okay, so he's saying here that part of the purpose of this is that some people would not understand the parables. And what is the reason for that? What's the central part of this that he says why they would not understand?
Their hearts are dull.
Their hearts are dull. Their hearts have grown dull. It's a matter of the heart. If our heart is open to the message of the gospel, to the message that Jesus is teaching, and if their hearts were open, as the disciples were, they wanted to learn more and they wanted to understand. And so he said, for you, it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom, because they wanted to know more. They desired to know more. Their hearts were not dull as a lot of these people were. We know that oftentimes they were following after Jesus to see the miracles, to be healed, to see the great signs that he would do, the wonders that he would do. But were they truly listening to his message? Were they truly understanding it so that they could do what he wanted them to do? And oftentimes they weren't. When he would speak in more plain language to them, there were oftentimes he would teach them some difficult things for them to comprehend or to understand, and many would leave and didn't want to follow him anymore. So with this idea, with these parables in mind, and speaking to the ones that wanted to understand, that had open ears and eyes and hearts to understand the message, we see, especially in this chapter, but in many other places, how do many of the parables begin?
Spoke a parable unto them saying.
Spoke a parable unto them saying, and what would be the first line of that parable before he would get into it?
There was a.
What's that?
There was a.
Maybe. Yeah, there was that. Specifically in this chapter, the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is like. Now, not all parables started that way, but and even the first parable that he starts in this chapter, he doesn't proceed with that. But many of them began with this idea: the kingdom of heaven is like. And we know from what we've studied that his message has been, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And so now he's trying to get them to understand, what is the nature of this kingdom? What can these parables teach us? What can we learn about the nature of the kingdom? And so the first one is one that we're well familiar with. It's one of the few that we have later on in the chapter that we have an actual detailed explanation from Jesus as to what the parable means. But in verse 3, it says, "And he told them many things in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears, let him hear." And again, this ending here to this parable is a common ending. Again, not on all of them, but he does use this quite a bit. Basically saying, if your ears are open, if your heart is open, as we see in the next verses, then understand what I'm trying to say. So really, when we think about what can we take from this, what can we learn, especially about the kingdom.
There's four kind of hearts.
What's that?
Four kind of hearts.
Yes, there's different people have different reactions to the gospel, different hearts about the gospel. And in this case, in this parable, the sower is not necessarily discriminating with where he sows the seed. It falls on all these hearts. And so now obviously, as the seeds began to take root or grow, we understand this idea from farming and things like that. The seeds that started to produce fruit, the seeds that started to grow, would be the ones that the farmer would tend and try to care for those more. But when we're putting the seed out, when we're trying to spread the message, we need to be very careful that we don't discriminate in who we're sowing the message to. Now, we also need to be smart about it, and that we're trying to get the most out of what we're sowing. But again, this idea is that he spread it over all these different grounds. And we see the reactions of the different people. And when we look at the description that Jesus gives later, we understand that the stony ground, or the wayside, was the ones that hear the word and it doesn't take root at all. They don't care. They don't want to hear it. It doesn't penetrate their hearts at all. And the birds, the cares of the world, just come and take that seed away, and the seed can't get in. It can't take root at all. And then we have the ones that hear it and are glad, and I think of this as more the emotional reaction to the gospel and the feel-good message of the gospel, but there's no root there. There's no deep understanding of the word and desire to grow in the word and in the foundation and the root of that word. So because of that, they grow up quickly, and it has the appearance initially of producing fruit and growing well. But when the sun comes up and the cares of the world come out, then it scorches the plant because it doesn't have the root. It doesn't have that foundation that it needs to withstand the trials of the world. And then the ones that were sown among the thorns. In verse 22, as for what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. Again, the seed starts to grow and comes up out of the ground, but all those things around it, all the cares that we have in this world, the things that keep us busy, preoccupied, the pursuit of riches, as it says, the deceitfulness of riches, it chokes us out, and it makes the word unfruitful in those hearts. But it makes, again, those plants, those people are not fruitful. They become unfruitful. So we can even see that within the church, that there's some that have that appearance, but the cares of the world prevent them from producing the fruit that they need to produce. And then the final one, of course, is the good soil. And it's interesting here as well that the other seeds fell among the good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. So even among those that understand the word and do the word and produce fruit, there's varying degrees of how much fruit is produced. And he isn't condemning that. He isn't saying that there's anything wrong with that. And we understand from another parable, the parable of the talents, that some people are given maybe more ability or different abilities to produce fruit in different ways, but we're all still fruitful. Those of us that are fruitful, and that's the point, is that according to the ability that we are given and according to the opportunities that we are given, that we use those to be fruitful however much we can, the best way that we can. So going on to the next parable, the parable of in the ESV, it's the parable of the weeds, is the way it reads that. I think other versions, it's the parable of the tares. But starting in verse 24, it says, he put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, while his men were sleeping, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and went away. And when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds? He said to them, an enemy has done this. So the servants said to them, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he said, No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let them grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first, and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. So, again, this is another one that we have an explanation on later on. And we understand fairly easily, the one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man, it says down in verse 37, is Jesus, is the Christ. That he's sown the good seed out into the world. The field is the world. And the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. And the weeds are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. And the harvest is the close of the age, and the reapers are angels. And just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so it will be at the close of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So, Satan is constantly trying to fill the field with bad seed. We've seen that ever since the fall of man in the garden, that he's trying to sow this bad seed that may sound like the good seed, that may look like the good seed. In my Bible, I've got a note that this weed that was potentially sown was a weed that had the appearance, looked a lot like wheat in the garden. So it may have been difficult to tell the difference between the weeds and the actual wheat. But to the man who owned the field, to the farmer, the gardener that knew what they were doing, they would be able to discern which ones were the weeds and which ones weren't. So the enemy is always trying to sow this bad seed. And the other interesting point in this is sometimes the indication here seems to be that sometimes God's delay in punishing the wicked, we often see why do the wicked prosper? Why don't the wicked suffer? Because of the things that they do. And it would seem to indicate that sometimes God's delay in punishing the wicked is for the sake of the righteous, to prevent any harm to the righteous, that for whatever reason that may be, that the ultimate punishment, the ultimate end is at the reaping, at the end of the age, when the weeds will be gathered and burned, and the righteous will shine like the sun, as it says. So we need to keep that in mind, that the reward and the punishment is not here in this age during this time. In this new age, in this age of the world that we are in, of the kingdom, that eventually the weeds will be weeded out at the end during the harvest. So going on now to the mustard seed, parable of the mustard seed. In verse 31. He put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it is grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. The kingdom started small in the beginning. Think about the day of Pentecost and the 120 disciples that were there, the 12 apostles, the 12th that was added before the day of Pentecost there to take Judas's place. This small beginning there in Jerusalem, but how quickly it caught fire. Even on that first day, over 3,000 souls were added to the kingdom. You think about this mustard seed, this idea of the smallest of all seeds, but it becomes a mighty tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. The kingdom started small, but has become a great kingdom, a great tree in the world, and a place of refuge, that the birds can come and build their nests in its branches. We should be an example that people can see. People could see the mighty mustard, the big mustard tree, especially when you plant it compared to all the other, as it says, all the other garden plants. And it becomes this great tree. But we need to be a place as well that people can come for refuge from the world. That it's a... Sorry, I lost my thought. Not necessarily a fortress, but a place of security from the world among each other, that we share this faith together. So going on to the next one, verse 33, this is a short one. He says, the kingdom of heaven, again, that phrase, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. It's all that we have in this parable. It's interesting here. In other instances, Jesus uses the idea of leaven as a negative thing. He talks about the leaven of the Pharisees. And really, it's when you look at it here and you look at it there, the idea of leaven is just this idea of the influence that other people have. When you put a little bit of leaven into some flour, into some dough, it has a huge influence on that bread, on what it becomes. Whether it's unleavened bread like we have here, flat and doesn't grow into a whole lot. When you put a little bit of leaven into that, how much does that grow and become because of that leaven? So we need to be careful of this bad influence of the Pharisees and those like them. But the kingdom is to be a good influence into the world. That we are to show that influence to the world, that our influence in the world is a good thing for the world. When we go back to talking about the parable that we just looked at, or before the mustard seed, the parable of the weeds, if the whole garden had been full of weeds and there was no good fruit, then the master would have told the servants, tear it all up, start over, plant good seed again. But because there was some good seed there, the field was preserved. And so in that way, the kingdom helps to preserve the world and to continue to influence the world, to hopefully bring the world to as much salvation as possible.
If I could find 10 righteous souls, I would not destroy a city for this day.
Yeah, I didn't put that in my notes, but I had that thought, the Sodom and Gomorrah.
Noah and his family preserved the world.
Noah and his family. They were the only ones preserved, but through them and their efforts and saving the animals, the world was preserved. So we have to be that influence to the world. We can't allow the world to influence us to the point where all the good seed is gone and it's nothing but weeds. So we have to be that good influence to the world.
Rick,
Yes.
in the matter of looking at ourselves in some of these parables, especially the parable of the sword. In Luke's account of the same sword, the parable of the sword, he ends by saying, those when they could run, those had a noble and good heart. The receive the word and bear fruit and obey. In Acts 17:11, where Paul is preaching at Rica, Luke said, these were noble in that they received the word called readiness of mind and searched the scriptures daily whether these things were so. So that puts more commentary on what the good say, good heart is talking about in the parable of the sower. For those who would receive with readiness of mind and search out the scriptures. As Jesus said in John 5, search the scriptures.
Yeah.
So those who have that good and honest heart and desire for truth will be searchers for truth.
Yeah, it's very good. And thank you for that effort. That's what I was trying to maybe get across a little bit earlier. Probably didn't do a good job. That the idea is to be acceptable to God, to understand the message and produce fruit. It has to be an active process. We have to be seeking out the truth. We have to study and try to understand it so that we can apply it and produce that fruit that comes from that. So the next two parables, these really kind of go together. It's kind of the same idea in these two parables, verses 44 through 46. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it. So the first obvious lesson here is that the kingdom is so great a treasure that it should be worth it to us to give up everything. That's what these men did. They went and sold everything that they had to obtain these treasures. The other interesting thing that I've often thought about with these is we have to obtain it the right way. How easy would it have been for that man that found the treasure in the field to just dig it up and take it? But no, he knew that the treasure was in that field. Whoever owned that field, the treasure belonged to them. So he went and bought the field so that he could obtain the treasure. Now, we're not buying our salvation in any means. The point is that there was a right way and a wrong way about doing it. Just as for us, there's a right way and many wrong ways to obtain the kingdom, to be part of the kingdom. And we have to make sure we're doing it the right way, the way that it's supposed to be done. The next one, I'm sorry I'm going through these kind of quickly. I want to try to get through as many of these as we can, because I think there's so many different things when we look at all of these together about the kingdom and about our attitude toward the kingdom that we can gain from these. Verse 47, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the close of the age, the angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So, again, this is very similar, again, to the parable of the weeds, this idea that everyone will be gathered up at the end, and the righteous and the unrighteous will be separated out. The righteous on one, the unrighteous on the other. We see this imagery throughout Scripture and talking about the day of judgment. That in the day of judgment, the righteous will be separated out and will receive their reward, and the unrighteous will receive their reward. But that will come at the close of the age. So then, I want to go on now to Matthew chapter 18.
Before you go there, if
Yeah,
you don't mind.
good.
Chapter 25, again, verse 31, Jesus is describing the same thing we just read here in the parable, which said that all the nations will be gathered before him when he sits on the throne of glory, and they will be separated as a shepherd divides the sheep from the goats. The sheep will go on the right hand and the goats on the left. And that's That's the judgment scene that he's describing here again, isn't it?
Yeah. It's the same idea, that there will be this separation that we'll see finally on Judgment Day. And he goes on in verse 25 and talks about the things that were done by those on the right. And, when talks about, when I was hungry, you gave me food, thirsty, you gave me drink. And they ask, when did we see you and do these things? And he says, when you did it to the least of my brothers, you did it to me. So we see, the things that we do in this life will determine where we go with that separation at the end. So going on to chapter 18. And this chapter, we're not going to read through the whole chapter. There's just a couple of parables in here, but there's really one that I want to focus on. It starts off with this discussion among the apostles, among the disciples, of who was the greatest in the kingdom. And it's when Jesus uses the example of bringing the child into their midst, and whoever becomes like a child is the greatest in the kingdom. And he talks about the temptations to sin, where he says, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. And then he goes on to this parable of the lost sheep. The idea, what do you think if a man has 100 sheep? He says, see that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. What do you think if a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray? Does he not leave the 99 in the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. So, talking about the idea of children and not causing them to sin, and then he goes into this discussion of forgiving our brothers, forgiving those that sin against us. And then Peter, the beginning of this parable here, the parable is initiated by Peter's question, Lord, how often will my brother, verse 21, of chapter 18, verse 21. Then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. And therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared. And he goes into this parable that we'll read through. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold, with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of the servant released him and forgave him the debt. We'll stop right there for a minute. So, he owes his master 10,000 talents. There's a lot of different things, depending on what commentary you read or what you look at, as to exactly what this amount would be equivalent to today. One of the ones that I looked at was basically, if you looked at how much a talent was worth, and it was basically a weight of silver, a certain amount of silver, how much that was worth, and you looked at how much a normal laborer, a day laborer who worked in a vineyard or a field or whatever, how much they would receive, a talent would be equivalent to about 16 years of wages. That's 1 talent. So we're talking about 10,000 talents. So that's 160,000 years of wages. So if you equate that to a daily wage today of maybe $100 a day that someone would make. That's over $6 billion. Just to give you a rough estimate, a rough idea. The point of the idea here and the point of this amount was that it was an unpayable amount. A servant of a master in 10 lifetimes would not be able to earn enough to pay this debt back. It was an unpayable debt. There was no way. It even indicates that a little bit when we read it. He said he owed him 10,000 talents, and since he could not pay, it doesn't say that the servant said, I can't pay this. It was just an understood that there was no way this servant could pay this debt. The master was about to do what this servant deserved. We have no idea how in the world this servant came according to this debt, and that's not the point. The point is he owed this debt, and in order to pay that debt, he would lose his life. He would be sold, his wife, his children, all that he had to pay for this debt. And so obviously we understand, as we look at this parable, this debt is our sin, the sin that we have in our lives. And there is no way for us to pay the debt for that sin and be able to have eternal life, to gain our life. The wages of sin is death. Because we have sin in our life, we deserve death. We deserve eternal death, eternal condemnation. That is what we deserve. That is our wages for the sin in our life. No matter how much sin you have, that is the wages for that. But because of the imploring of this servant, the master forgave the debt. It wasn't the servant said, have patience with me and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of the servant released him and forgave the debt. It wasn't okay, I'll give you some more time to try to pay the debt. The debt was wiped clean. He no longer owed that debt. He was forgiven an unforgivable debt. But then the parable goes on, picking up again in verse 28. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, "Pay what you owe." So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me and I will pay you." The same thing this servant just said to his master, that his fellow servant now says to him. He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should you not have had mercy on your fellow servant, as I had mercy on you?" And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. And really, when you get down to it here, the point is, with the debt that we have been forgiven as Christians, the sin that was wiped away by the blood of Jesus, that we contact through baptism, with that debt that has been paid, been forgiven, how petty do our squabbles and disagreements and arguments that we have among ourselves seem in comparison to that?
If we don't love our brothers, then we will be condemned.
Yeah. 10,000 talents versus 100 denarii. This was maybe a couple $100 that this other servant owed him. Pales in comparison to the debt that he was just forgiven. But yet, his heart was not changed by that debt that he was forgiven. And it caused him to be unforgiving to his fellow servant, to his fellow man. So, again, how can we expect God to forgive us if we're not going to forgive others? If we're not going to forgive our brothers and sisters in Christ, our fellow servants. That's what we are. We're all fellow servants in the kingdom. So I was hoping we might get into Luke and some of the parables there, but we're just out of time. But hopefully, like I said, I know I went through a lot of these pretty quick, but wanted to hit some of the high points, some of the big items that we can get from all these parables, especially about the kingdom and the nature of the kingdom and our interaction with others within the kingdom and the things that we can take from that. So, thank you.
Thank you.